Hello everyone and welcome to another one of our How to Sculpt, and we are going to be discussing today how to sculpt Jolteon from Pokémon. Now, like anything in aluminum foil sculpting, if you can master 3 basic techniques, then you could basically sculpt anything, but with the time, practice, and experience of knowing when and where each technique is appropriate. Much like the ability to draw requires only that you hold the pencil and also are applying certain techniques in depth and shading, those are the sort of things that you will practice and get better at in time when learning any medium in 2D art. In sculpting, all you need to know is the following tricks. First, how to turn a 2D shape into a 3D shape. Second, how to work in details through the pinching, and of course being able to attach 2 separate pieces to each other. Working in parts and so forth has been the technique that I've been using in these videos. So if you want to adopt your own technique, you can, but this is what I'll be demonstrating in this video. So starting off, of course, if we're going to practice before we get into Jolteon, let's start with the 3 basics. Tearing off is fairly straightforward, and I'd like you to tear off 3 separate pieces to practice each section. They, of course, should be similar in size, but they don't have to be in order to get the point across. The first, preferably the longest piece, will be how to get a 2D shape, this flat piece of metal paper, into a 3D shape, that is, into something with some depth and width and height. So when we're doing this, we need to understand that metal paper, aluminum foil, is very forgiving when it comes to what you do with it and when. However, when we're making a 3D sculpture and we want it to fit that sort of 2D to 3D form, we don't want to just crush it flat because that just makes another 2D shape. We want to meet just in the middle with a light and stopping at a certain point, hold, and being able to, with just the opening and closing of your hand, set a limit so that you have a 3D shape instead of a 2D one. Now, this will be, of course, important for when you're doing limbs, heads, body shapes, the like. The second is working in details. What will be important when working on Jolteon's spike, fur and hair and ears and nose and everything else. And this will be done simply through pinching using these primary fingers. What I want you to do is to, on your own time and in your own way, within and without, sculpt and pinch 2 separate shapes, both inside and outside, and preferably you can do a circle if you are feeling ambitious, but all that needs to be done is simply that, to make 2 shapes both on the inside and on the edges out of the whole page. Now, I'm going to make a square on the outside and a triangle on the inside just to demonstrate the technique, and you can follow along. On the inside, I'm going to, using these primary fingers, my pointer finger and my thumb, pinch, both pushing pressure on the piece and pinching the pieces so that I have a line within them. Then, meeting at a specific line, I'm going to pinch another, meeting at that angle, and closing the shape with another, I form a triangle. The glare there, that should be visible on camera. The shape and lines are contoured in the middle. Now on the outside, obviously that doesn't look too much like a square, so let's do the same thing we did on the inside, but with individual and certain images in mind of what a square or a rectangle is going to look like. I'm pinching the edges, but I'm trying not to disturb the triangle on the inside. This will be important for when you're adding details to your sculpture, in this case Jolteon, but not wanting to mess up what you've already worked so hard to put into it. And note, this is, if it's your first time doing it, you're not going to be good right off the bat. I've been doing this for 17 years, so I've become very familiar with my medium. If you work hard at it and you have fun doing it, then you will become not only adept at it, but capable of doing the sort of things you want to do without too many extra questions needed. And if note, you have questions or need help as you're sculpting along with me, feel free to ask in the comments and I'll reiterate points as they come. Or you can rewind the video, that works too. So, this would be a triangle within a square. And all I did was pinch using these 3 primary fingers, mainly these 2. So that is the second technique that you'll need to know in order to get this accomplished. The Jolteon sculpture I'm referring to, of course. The second and the final piece that we're going to be doing, I guess this would be the third numerically, is I want you to tear your piece in half and then fix it. Now obviously if I just put the pieces back together, that's not going to work. If I try to flatten the pieces together, still doesn't work. But we learned how to do some things earlier in molding and in pinching. So what I'm going to do is, with the idea in mind of wanting these two to be one piece again, I'm going to use our second technique in pinching by overlapping the 2 pieces and pinching them together. But this may hold up, but isn't quite enough, and that doesn't look very flat. So I'm going to use our first technique and flatten it out, using enough sure strength to make it fit the image that I want. And voila. So when we're talking about attaching pieces, say the spikes on Jolteon's fur or the ears, or perhaps extra details in layering or wrapping around, this is all going to come and become familiar in time. But if you can figure out these 3 main techniques, you can do anything that I'm doing with enough time, familiarity, and practice. So with all of that said, let's get to Jolteon. Starting, of course, well, since it is recyclable, why don't we do that? First thing that we're going to do is remember the basics. Jolteon, in a nutshell, is just a fox with a lot of static electricity in her fur, or his, depending on what Eevee you chose to give your Thunderstone to. So, starting with those pieces, I'm going to reuse some of our body parts and use this as a body. And notice I'm just wrapping it around like as if I'm preparing some sort of dough, and giving myself a neck, a tail, and a body. Now, adding a layer, I'm going to tear out a new piece. And keeping in mind that I want this in the end to look like Jolteon. Along the way, it can look about as messy as can be, as long as the finished result is what I intended. I can keep working on it until I'm satisfied with the result. But for the basics, what does Jolteon have? Not too much of a visible tail, more the spikes go off to the side, so we'll work on that in a moment. But like a fox, she has 2 large ears, a head, and 2 front legs and 2 back legs, so 4 legs. So I'm going to, with that in mind, tear out pieces for 4 legs, and then I'll add on muscle details and shape them later on. And notice, I'm going to tear, but not all the way. Stopping to a point, if you can see, so that I'm not tearing off an entire strip. I'm giving myself room to attach this to the body, like with our third technique, and being able to do so with the 4 appendages. 1, 2, 3, 4. Those will be our legs. Now, everything else we can attach on in a moment, but for right now, we're just going to focus on the main body. I'm going to wrap this. Notice what I'm doing. Wrap this just like we did with the 3D shape, and pinch in the details to make sure all of the excess places aren't where I need them to be. Now, this looks more like a tentacle than a Jolteon, so let's get the legs and arms where they ought to be. I'm going to, without tearing it off, just grabbing a section of the strip I intend to be using for a back leg and moving it to the back. Doing the same thing on this side and continuously adjusting until it's somewhat of a quadrupedic state. Then I'm going to, using our first technique, start to mold down the arms and the legs, or the front and back feet, depending on your preference of pronunciation. It's not really pronunciation, but anyway. Notice also as well, I'm taking that time to press in on the body, using that molding technique, but with my pinching fingers, and getting it into the sort of shape that reflects what Jolteon will. Also noting I'm keeping the neck separate and the arms and legs as individualized as possible, remembering what we talked about with the pinching technique. So now we've got 4 legs, a neck, and room for a tail. Jolteon doesn't have much of a tail, but we'll address that in a moment. I need these legs, though, to look a little bit more like a fox's, more like Jolteon's tails, and I'm having trouble pronouncing legs and identifying them as such. But this isn't going to be enough for me, so what I'm going to do is just tear off small strips, wrap them around the areas, and noting that the upper part of the leg is going to have more muscle, I'll do less pressure when molding and pinching it in. But the more I get towards the knee, I will narrow the pinching. Now, this animal-like feature for Jolteon, being like a fox, notes that the leg doesn't bend back but bends forward. So I'm going to push this forward and do the same. Give myself a little bit of room. If I have the detail in mind that I want her to have toes, maybe I can tear off individual toes. And noting this point is more for advanced learners, but notice that, just like I did with the legs, I have room here to do each of her little toes. And I'm going to roll them up just like I did with the legs, but using the pinching technique. And that would be one leg. You can do that for the 3 others, and you can watch me do so as you practice as well. Notice I'm doing these 3 quickly only because I have done this so many times. If you want more familiarity with them, keep practicing with them. And as long as the end result looks right, don't worry about what it looks like in the meantime. Now, moving on to the head. And this will be one of the more complicated parts. There are, of course, going to be many different features to that aspect of Jolteon's body. We'll have large ears, and we'll also have staticky and spiked cheeks, as well as a pointed nose contoured to fit what the animal looks like. Now, the Pokemon, excuse me. Giving ourselves lots of room to work with. But also taking a note mentally, we want it to fit the rest of the body. We don't want to have a giant head and a regular body. We want to make sure the head matches the body. So the ultimate width of the head and height and depth is going to be just about as big, as thick as the waist, given what our mental image, or if you perhaps have the image of Jolteon nearby, keeping that in balance. But starting, of course, with the neck and attaching the head, we'll use most of our detail and making sure, our material to work with rather, in wrapping around. Notice what I'm doing. I'm wrapping around that neck and then pinching it tight in place. And notice I'm doing a lot of pressure here, doing it very tight so that it ultimately is going to stay, since we don't want our Jolteon's head falling off. That would be bad. Now we have all this to work with, so let's tear off a few sections just like we did for our arms and legs, and do so in a way where it's going to reflect its ears, its cheeks, its nose, its head as a whole. 2 for the ears, which are going to be rather large. I'm going to mold them into place just like we did with the feet. Looks like a little rabbit. I'm going to fold this over and down. Since I don't need this much space, I'm just going to crush it all down while leaving these ears intact, just like with the triangle. I'm going to, as I mold it down, use my pinching technique to pinch in a nose. And note we'll flatten that out and make the cheeks match in a moment. Flatten the forehead with my thumb. Use my thumb, or pointer finger if you wish, and specifically my fingernail, to carve in 2 little angry eyes, and allow the rest of my finger to actually indent on the eyeballs, and make little adjustments along the way. Now, this will be the spikes in a moment, but let's start with the ears. The ears are going to look like large leaflets, perhaps with some spikes along the way. I'll show you how to do that in a moment. But for the sake of this video, let's make sure that they're both in the right place, first of all, where the ears should be. And then pinching along the edges, just like we did on the outside with our rectangle or square, I'm going to pinch in a circular diamond, a leaf. Notice I'm rolling what excess I don't need and pinching in what I do, so that it looks like that. I'll do the same for the other side. Do a little closer to the camera so that you can enjoy the sight and practice on your own. Now for the spikes, this is going to be fairly straightforward and will also come in handy if you want to do any of the other evolutions. You can take those little sections and just tear off a piece, but using, just like we did with our thumb or our wrist as that standard for how far we're going to tear, only go as far as your fingernail can feel, and give ourselves a little bit of a spike and pinch it. So noting that very small little detail will go a long way in standing out and saying, oh, that's not Umbreon, that's not Espeon, that's Jolteon. Do that in various points where you feel it is appropriate. The same for the other side. Obviously, when I'm folding, I want to keep these lines straight. These are just little details to more ease my conscience rather than yours. I have a very high expectation of myself, since I not only know what it looks like, but I know what I want it to look like. So I'm going to add on these details. If yours just looks like a normal fox and you can work on it along the way, that's fine too. But for the sake of Jolteon being Jolteon rather than just a large and taller Eevee, I'm going to keep adding on these secondary details as I go instinctively. As far as the spikes that are going to be contouring Jolteon's cheeks, I'm going to tear off 2 sections to cover both sides. Use my middle finger to press in along the cheek, and like I did with the ears, tear or pinch in individual spikes and pushing them into place at the same time. Now notice I'm not doing anything that you're not already familiar with. I'm just doing it at the right time and in the right way so that it looks the way I want it to. Little damage was done to the eyes, so I'll just re-imprint that with my fingernail. Pinching, pressing, molding, but leaving the rest of the sculpture intact. I think that will suffice as far as Jolteon's head for now. That neck looks a little long, so what I'm going to do is, doing my best to preserve the integrity of the head, I'm going to press it in and use my thumb as a balance so that it looks a little bit more anatomically correct. Now, as far as the tail is concerned, just the legs here where appropriate. Maybe the back can use a little bit of a curve as well. Notice all I did was just indent with my finger. This obviously can be folded in, but I'm going to use this as a base to attach these spikes that will go off to the sides. And I'm going to make them separately and attach them later. I'm going to set these 2 long pieces aside just for another layer's sake. A little bit of reinforcement. And in working on these, I'm going to tear off individual pieces and strips and make them into small triangles. If memory serves, I think 4 or 5 may suffice for each side. Pinching on the outside, using my thumb, continuously flattening it down, and pinching and twisting, just like on the tip of a pencil, to a point, exactly to where and how I want it to look. And where I want it to be. One more. pinch that in a little bit on the sides. And that will be Jolteon's first spike. Second, notice I can keep making adjustments. Just because I've sculpted it at one point doesn't mean I now have to live with that result. I only stop when I believe I'm finished. Now, rolling this over and giving myself sort of a belt to wrap around Jolteon. I'll also use the extra tail piece in a moment. Rolling around and molding together. I'm going to attach this to both sides. Notice I'm wrapping around just wherever it's ultimately going to be appropriate. I'll do it under and over and pinch in the details where I think they're going to most fit, be most appropriate to get it to look the way I want it to. Same for the other side. That lightsaber ignition is in no way sponsored or endorsed by Disney or LucasArts. Good thing I don't monetize these. And there we have it. That would be our Jolteon. Now, if you have any questions or would like to see anything else made, both in this format or beyond it, I'd be happy to do so. I look forward to seeing your sculptures and hope that you enjoyed this time, and I'll look forward to doing more with them in the future.